The cameras were rolling, the lights were hot, and the tension in the room could have cut glass. Then, like a storm breaking without warning, Dan Bongino's voice thundered through the air. He leaned forward, fists nearly pounding the table, his words sharpened into a roar. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're out of your league here." The crowd stirred. A murmur of discomfort rippled across the room, some glancing nervously toward the moderators, others fixated on the sheer force of Bongino's anger. His voice wasn't just loud. It was an attempt to dominate, to suffocate every other perspective in the space. The kind of performance meant to intimidate, to rattle, to silence. But at the center of that storm sat Jasmine Crockett. She didn't twitch. She didn't blink. Her shoulders remained still, her expression composed, as if his shouting had crashed against a wall of unshakable calm. Her silence in that moment was louder than any rebuttal, a posture that declared, "You cannot break me." The cameras zoomed in. Viewers at home leaned forward. Would she snap back? Would she match rage with rage? That's what Bongino wanted. A fight on his terms, chaos he could command. But Jasmine Crockett was playing a different game. She inhaled slowly, eyes steady, her voice finally emerging with the weight of quiet authority. No yelling, no panic, just a line that cut sharper than any insult. Delivered like ice in a room set on fire. "Dan," she said evenly, her tone almost disarming in its restraint. "When the shouting stops, the truth will still be standing." The words seemed to hang in the air, pulling all the oxygen from the room. For the first time, Bongino hesitated. The crowd shifted again, but this time with a current of recognition. Something had shifted. The power dynamic no longer belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the calmest, and in that frozen silence, with millions watching, it became clear. No one could have predicted how those few words would flip the entire debate upside down. The silence after Jasmine's calm rebuke didn't just hang, it echoed. For a brief electric second, the room seemed unsure how to breathe. Bongino had thrown his punch, and instead of chaos, his blow had landed in a void of composure. The energy shifted. But to understand why this moment mattered, why it jolted so many watching into disbelief, we have to step back. This wasn't just an argument on a stage. This was a collision of two Americas. On one side, Dan Bongino, the brash former Secret Service agent turned right-wing firebrand, a man who thrived on shouting down opponents, weaponizing volume to disguise weakness. His persona was built on dominance. The louder, the harsher, the more combative, the better. To him, this wasn't debate. It was combat, and combat demanded submission. On the other side, Jasmine Crockett, a rising Democratic congresswoman from Texas, known for her sharp wit and unapologetic voice in defending marginalized communities. She carried herself with the knowledge of someone who had faced dismissal, underestimation, and disrespect 1,000 times before. But instead of folding, she had built armor from it, armor that didn't clang with anger, but gleamed with resolve. The stage itself was symbolic, a national forum, televised, dissected in real time on social media, with millions ready to clip, share, and hashtag every exchange. It wasn't just a clash between two figures. It was a referendum on tone, on tactics, on whether rage or reason would win the day. Bongino's allies were confident going in. "She won't be able to handle him," they'd whispered before cameras rolled. "He'll eat her alive." They believed sheer force would crush subtlety, that bluster would drown dignity. For them, the narrative was already written, a veteran of the conservative outrage machine humiliating a younger, progressive voice. But that script was about to unravel, because Jasmine wasn't rattled. Her calm response wasn't just words. It was a statement of control. And control, in moments of live confrontation, is everything. The stakes were rising not just for the two of them, but for what each represented. Bongino's tirade wasn't simply about policy. It was about identity, about silencing a woman of color in a space where voices like hers had long been told to sit down. Jasmine's composure wasn't simply restraint, it was defiance, a refusal to surrender her dignity no matter how loud the storm raged. And as the audience processed what they'd just witnessed, the undercurrent of tension thickened. If Jasmine could withstand this barrage without flinching, what would she do when the gloves really came off? What would happen when Bongino doubled down, when he reached deeper into his arsenal of insults and interruptions? The crowd didn't have to wait long. The energy in Bongino's face made it clear he wasn't finished. He couldn't let the room slip from his grip. He would escalate. He would press harder. He would not be shown up by calm authority. But what happened next left even his most loyal supporters struggling to defend him. Because the more he pushed, the clearer it became. He was up against an opponent who had prepared her whole life for moments just like this, and the next clash would expose the cracks in his facade for everyone to see. To understand Dan Bongino's fury that night, the red face, the pointed finger, the desperate shouts. We need to trace the path that brought him there. Because men like Bongino don't arrive in these moments by accident. They are built for them, molded by years of grievance and theater, until confrontation becomes their oxygen. Bongino's career began in the shadows of power, as a Secret Service agent serving under presidents. For a time, he was seen as the consummate professional, disciplined, sharp, loyal. But behind the polished exterior, there was always a restless hunger. Service wasn't enough. Protecting power wasn't enough. Bongino craved a stage, an audience, a spotlight. And once he found it, he never looked back. His leap into conservative media was less a pivot than a revelation. Radio, television, YouTube, wherever he could broadcast, Bongino thrived. His formula was simple. Speak louder, cut harsher, and frame every opponent as an enemy of the people. He wasn't merely offering commentary. He was performing battle, and audiences, weary of complexity, rewarded him for it. To his base, Bongino wasn't a host. He was a warrior, but that performance carried a cost. Rage had to be constantly renewed. Volume had to be constantly raised. Over time, Bongino's style wasn't about persuasion. It was about domination. His opponents weren't sparring partners. They were targets. And his fans didn't want nuance. They wanted blood. This was the energy he brought into every debate stage, every podcast rant, every television clip that went viral. And it worked, at least with his base. Clips of Bongino shouting down liberals racked up millions of views. To his followers, he was the man saying what they wished they could say, cutting through what they believed were lies with the force of sheer conviction. But here was the flaw. Bongino mistook volume for power. He believed shouting was strength. He confused aggression with control, and that mistake would set the stage for his unraveling against Jasmine Crockett, because Crockett was not like the opponents he was used to. She wasn't a timid liberal pundit fumbling through policy points. She wasn't a cable news host bound by neutrality rules. She was a congresswoman, tested on the floor of the House, forged in the heat of Texas politics, sharpened by battles over identity, race, and justice. And unlike so many who had faced Bongino before, she refused to be intimidated. That night, Bongino walked on stage expecting a predictable script. He would attack, she would flinch, the crowd would laugh, and the clips would trend. But from the moment she met his shouts with silence and composure, the script began to disintegrate. The irony was brutal. Bongino had spent years crafting a persona of dominance, yet it took only one woman's calm to reveal its fragility. The more he raised his voice, the smaller he seemed. The more he pressed, the more desperate he appeared. And behind that desperation lay something deeper: fear. Fear of losing relevance in a world where loud no longer guaranteed respect. Fear of being overshadowed by a new generation of voices who didn't play by his rules. Fear that his signature weapon, aggression, could be neutralized by dignity. To the audience that night, Bongino wasn't just a commentator. He was a man wrestling with the collapse of his own myth. His every shout carried the weight of a career built on intimidation. His every interruption revealed the limits of his playbook, but Bongino couldn't stop himself. He doubled down. He sneered, he mocked, he swung insults like punches, because to him, retreat was impossible. In his world, to yield an inch was to admit defeat, and so he pressed harder, unaware that each escalation was digging his own rhetorical grave. The truth about Bongino, the truth his critics had always whispered, was now on full display. Without the armor of volume, without the shield of outrage, there was little left. The facade of strength crumbled under the weight of his own excess. The crowd could feel it. Social media viewers could sense it. Even his allies in the room shifted uneasily as they watched a man, long celebrated for his fire, ignite himself instead. And Jasmine Crockett? She was just getting started, because her story, her journey, her resilience, her clarity of purpose, was about to collide with his fury in a way that no one in that room would forget. And it was that collision, that stark contrast between noise and grace, that would flip the entire debate upside down. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's calm dismantling of Dan Bongino hit so hard, you need to know the woman behind the fire. Because Jasmine didn't arrive in that room by accident. Every ounce of her composure, every flicker of her resilience, was forged through battles most couldn't even imagine. She was born into a world that didn't roll out red carpets or open gilded doors. Her roots trace back to neighborhoods where success wasn't handed out. It had to be fought for. Her family instilled in her the values that would define her. Hard work, self-respect, and an unshakable belief in dignity, no matter how much the world tried to strip it away. While others grew up insulated by privilege, Jasmine grew up learning how to navigate struggle, and that difference mattered. From a young age, she refused to be quiet. Teachers noticed it in classrooms when she challenged assumptions others accepted. Coaches saw it in practice where she rallied teammates others dismissed. And later, professors recognized it in her relentless drive to understand not just the law, but justice. Law school wasn't easy. It was long nights, tight budgets, and the constant reminder that she was an outsider in spaces designed for the elite. But Jasmine didn't buckle. She sharpened herself, turning every barrier into fuel. Where others saw ceilings, she saw ladders. Each condescending glance, each whispered doubt, only made her work harder. Her legal career took her to the trenches, defending those who couldn't afford high-powered representation, standing with the marginalized when society was ready to write them off. She saw firsthand how power was often wielded not for fairness but for control. And she learned how to fight back. Not with fists or fury, but with clarity, confidence, and an unflinching sense of right and wrong. Politics, then, wasn't a career move. It was the natural extension of who she already was. When she entered the Texas legislature, she brought with her the same grit that carried her through courtrooms. She spoke unapologetically about identity, about race, about the America that too often tried to silence people who looked like her. And that voice, sharp, unyielding, proud, resonated with voters who were tired of being ignored. By the time she rose to Congress, Jasmine had become more than a politician. She was a symbol, a representative not just of her district, but of a generation that refused to apologize for existing. She spoke with the cadence of someone who had endured slights and insults and survived them all. When others wavered, she stood tall. When others bent to political winds, she anchored herself in truth. That is the Jasmine Crockett who walked into the debate with Dan Bongino. Not a rookie, not a token presence, but a woman who had faced down far worse than raised voices and cheap theatrics. To Bongino, shouting was strategy. To Jasmine, it was noise. She'd lived through storms much louder, and she'd come out stronger every time. And here was the real twist. Crockett didn't just bring resilience. She brought identity as her armor. She didn't shrink from being a black woman in politics. She wielded it as a source of power. She knew that every time she spoke, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for communities who had been dismissed, belittled, underestimated. She carried that weight not as a burden, but as a charge. This is why her calm mattered so much in that explosive moment with Bongino. Because it wasn't just her calm. It was the calm of her ancestors, of her community, of every person who had been told to sit down and know their place. Her stillness was defiance. Her poise was protest. Her measured words were a reminder that dignity cannot be shouted down. And so, while Bongino believed he could rattle her, drown her voice with his volume, Jasmine knew better. She had already endured louder rooms, harsher dismissals, more dangerous stakes. His shouting was just one more test in a lifetime of trials. And like every other test before it, she would rise. But what made her rise so compelling wasn't just survival. It was transformation. Jasmine had turned every slight into strength, every doubt into determination. Her career wasn't a straight path paved by connections. It was a jagged climb, carved with her own hands. That gave her a different kind of confidence. A confidence rooted not in arrogance, but in earned resilience. That night, when she met Bongino's rage with silence, the crowd may not have understood the depth of that silence. They may not have known the history stitched into her composure. But they felt it. They felt the gravity of a woman who had spent her life preparing for moments exactly like this one. And Jasmine knew it too. This wasn't just a debate. It was another chapter in her lifelong mission. to prove that the underestimated can rise, the silenced can speak, and the dismissed can dominate. She wasn't just ready for Bongino. She was built for him, because in the clash between noise and dignity, the outcome is inevitable. Noise fades, dignity endures, and as the room held its breath, everyone could sense it. Jasmine Crockett was about to turn Dan Bongino's greatest weapon into the very thing that destroyed him. The shouting match didn't begin with fireworks. It began with a spark. Dan Bongino leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain, tossing a pointed accusation across the table. The words weren't just sharp, they were calculated. He wanted a reaction. He wanted Jasmine Crockett to break, to stumble, to give him the spectacle he could spin as victory. But Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes held steady, her posture unshaken. The silence between them stretched, heavy, until Bongino decided to push harder. His volume rose, his tone sharp as steel, each sentence building into the next. He jabbed with words like weapons, his cadence designed to overwhelm rather than persuade. The audience felt it. The room buzzed with unease. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Bongino's voice echoed off the walls. Some shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the aggressiveness on display. Others leaned forward, waiting for Jasmine to fire back, to match his intensity with equal force. Then came Sotomayor's line of questioning from earlier in the evening, referenced again by Bongino as though it were a cudgel. He twisted it, framed it, and pressed it against Jasmine like a blade. And when that didn't land, he invoked Gorsuch's framing, piling insult upon insinuation. By now, Bongino wasn't just raising his voice, he was shouting. His hands cut the air, his face flushed with the heat of his own indignation. Every syllable dripped with condescension, as though his loudness alone would be enough to silence her. The tension thickened. The crowd murmured again, louder this time, sensing the imbalance. Here was a man using brute force of volume against a woman wielding only stillness. The imbalance wasn't just rhetorical, it was symbolic. A representation of power trying to crush dignity, noise trying to drown out truth. For a moment it seemed as if the storm would swallow the stage. Bongino's rant rolled on, each accusation more brazen than the last. The room vibrated with the sheer weight of his performance. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing every bead of sweat, every flinch from the audience, every flicker of expectation on faces wondering when, or if, Jasmine would finally respond. And then it happened. Jasmine shifted ever so slightly. She raised her chin, lifted her gaze, and inhaled. The smallest movement, yet in the tense silence that followed Bongino's tirade, it felt seismic. The audience hushed. Even Bongino, mid-gesture, seemed to sense something had shifted, because this was the moment everyone expected her to fold, to fire back in kind, to let her anger rise and meet his. It was the trap he'd been laying all along, provoke her into matching his fury so he could point and say, "See? Unfit, emotional, weak." But Jasmine Crockett was not about to give him that satisfaction. She let the silence stretch, long enough for the tension to become almost unbearable. The crowd leaned in, waiting for the explosion, waiting for her voice to finally cut through the noise. And in that waiting, Bongino's volume began to collapse under its own weight. Then, with a calm so deliberate it felt like ice slicing through fire, she spoke. Her words weren't shouted. They weren't rushed. They were steady, measured, and chilling in their simplicity. The effect was immediate. The murmurs ceased. The crowd froze. Bongino blinked, caught off guard by the composure he could neither rattle nor replicate. In that instant, the dynamic of the debate flipped. All of Bongino's volume, all of his bluster, suddenly seemed small in comparison to the controlled force of her restraint. The silence had been broken. The game had changed, and no one in that room, not even Bongino himself, could have predicted how Jasmine's next words would leave him completely unmoored. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dan Bongino had filled the room with noise, a storm of accusations, jabs, and theatrics. But now, after Jasmine Crockett's pause, the storm broke into stillness. And in that stillness she began. Her voice was calm, but it carried. Not with the brute force of volume, but with something far more unsettling for her opponent. Conviction. Each word landed like a drop of ice water on a burning flame. "Dan," she said, steady and unshaken, When you raise your voice, all you reveal is how little you actually have to say. The audience gasped. It wasn't just the line, it was the delivery. Quiet, razor sharp, delivered not with malice but with authority. She hadn't matched his anger. She had stripped it of power. Bongino tried to interject, but Jasmine didn't allow the tempo to break. She leaned in slightly, her gaze locking onto him, her tone unwavering. You shout because you hope no one notices the cracks in your argument. You interrupt because you fear what happens if people actually hear the truth. The cameras panned to Bongino's face. His smirk twitched, faltered, then stiffened again. But it was too late. The crowd had already caught the flicker of doubt. Jasmine pressed on. I didn't come here to perform, she said. I came here because the people I represent, the working families, the immigrants who built this country, the young voices silenced for too long, they deserve more than noise. They deserve honesty. The words rippled through the audience like a current. For the first time all evening, the murmurs weren't nervous. They were affirming. A wave of subtle nods, a hum of agreement. Bongino tried again, his voice rising to recapture dominance. Don't lecture me about honesty, he barked. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She held up a hand, not as a gesture of dismissal, but as a command for quiet. No, she said firmly, the word cutting through the air like a gavel. You don't get to shout down the truth. Not tonight. The audience erupted in applause, brief but thunderous. Bongino's face flushed. He shifted in his chair, a man suddenly unsure of his footing, and then Jasmine delivered the blow that would live in replay clips, in headlines, in hashtags across the nation. You call me unfit, you call me weak, but the truth is, the louder you get, the smaller you look. Because power isn't proven by how loud you yell, it's proven by how much respect you earn. And right now you've earned none. The line detonated. Gasps, claps, and audible ohs rolled across the room. Some in the audience leaned forward with wide eyes, others clapped with laughter and disbelief. It was the mic drop moment, the kind of counterattack that didn't just neutralize the opponent, it obliterated them. Bongino's smirk vanished. He leaned back, blinking rapidly, searching for his footing. For the first time, his voice didn't come immediately. His silence said everything. Jasmine wasn't done. She softened her tone, not with weakness, but with purpose. I don't need to out-yell you, she continued, because I know the people listening tonight care less about who can scream the loudest and more about who can stand with dignity. That's what leadership is. That's what service looks like. And if you can't understand that, then maybe you should sit down and listen for once in your life. The crowd exploded. Applause shook the room. Even those who had stayed neutral couldn't ignore the sheer clarity of the moment. Cameras captured the faces of stunned onlookers, wide eyes, raised eyebrows, open mouths. Bongino tried one final time to reassert control. His voice cracked slightly as he began. That's a nice speech, Congresswoman, but the but was drowned out, not by Jasmine, but by the audience. Applause surged again, rolling over his attempted retort like a tidal wave. It wasn't just Jasmine's words, it was the reaction. The collective energy had shifted, and Bongino was no longer commanding it, and Jasmine knew it. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her hands in victory. She simply sat back, calm as she had been from the start, the faintest hint of a smile playing at her lips. She had done exactly what she came to do, dismantle the noise, expose the hollowness, and stand taller without ever needing to shout. The moderators exchanged looks. One of them even allowed the ghost of a grin to slip through. They understood what everyone else in the room was beginning to realize. This wasn't just a counterattack. This was a transformation of the entire debate. Online, the moment was already alive. Phones had been recording, fingers were already typing, and clips were already finding their way into feeds. The phrases "sit down and listen" and "the louder you get, the smaller you look" were destined to trend within hours. Bongino's red face beside Jasmine's steady calm would become the split-screen symbol of a clash that defined more than just two voices. It defined two visions of what America could be. And yet, as powerful as the takedown was, Jasmine's composure left the audience sensing that the story wasn't finished. There was more to come, more ripple effects waiting beyond the stage, because this wasn't just a mic drop moment. It was the kind of spark that could ignite something larger. An argument that would outlive the room, outlive the debate, and reverberate across the country. As the applause continued, Bongino sat stiff, his voice silenced, his armor cracked. Jasmine leaned forward just once more, her final words of the night sealing the scene like a stamp. "You came here to shout, Dan. I came here to lead. And America can see the difference." The applause swelled again, filling every corner of the room. Cameras zoomed in on Bongino's defeated posture, then back to Jasmine's calm, unshaken expression. The debate wasn't over, but the outcome was already decided. And yet the true shockwaves weren't contained inside those four walls, because as the audience clapped and Bongino sat silent, the country beyond the cameras was just about to erupt. The debate might have ended in that room, but its life had only just begun. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine's takedown were ripped, edited, and posted across every major platform. On TikTok, the 10-second snippet, her calmly telling Bongino, "The louder you get, the smaller you look," was already looping endlessly. On Twitter, hashtags ignited. "Sit down, Dan," "Crockett clapback," "Respect over noise." The digital wildfire spread faster than any moderator could have imagined. Influencers with millions of followers shared the clip, calling it a masterclass in composure. Activists wrote threads praising Jasmine for exposing not just Bongino's tone, but the deeper sickness of politics, where shouting often replaced substance. Even comedians joined in, posting side-by-side memes of Bongino roaring like a cartoon bear while Jasmine calmly sipped tea. But the reaction wasn't one-sided. Bongino's defenders swarmed the same platforms, trying desperately to spin the narrative. They clipped her words out of context, mocked her as soft, accused her of being scripted, yet every attempt seemed to backfire. Because the visuals told their own story. His flushed face, his veins taut, his fists pounding, juxtaposed with her calm, piercing gaze. No caption could rewrite what millions had seen with their own eyes. On YouTube, reaction videos stacked up within hours. Political commentators left and right replayed the exchange frame by frame. Progressives hailed it as a historic moment, a modern echo of when dignity confronted bluster. Moderates called it the turning point of the night. Even some conservative voices admitted, grudgingly, that Bongino had lost his cool and handed Jasmine the spotlight. Late-night TV didn't miss it either. Monologues opened with jokes about the exchange, playing the clip to roaring studio audiences. One host quipped, "Dan Bongino came to shout. Jasmine Crockett came to lead, and America decided which one it wanted more." The line got laughs. But beneath it was something deeper, the sense that this wasn't just entertainment, it was cultural judgment. In barbershops, classrooms, and workplaces, the clip became a conversation starter. Young people shared it with captions like, "This is how you handle bullies." Teachers played it as an example of debate strategy. Immigrant families saw Jasmine's calm fire as validation, proof that dignity could cut through even the loudest hostility. And as the praise mounted, so did the pressure on Bongino. His team scrambled to issue statements, insisting he had stood strong and didn't back down. But the more they insisted, the weaker it looked against the avalanche of memes painting him as a man defeated by his own volume. The ripple effects extended into politics itself. Members of Congress tweeted support for Jasmine, calling her response a proud moment for the House. Journalists penned op-eds about the cultural meaning of the clash, how it revealed America's hunger for calm strength over chaos. And polls, early and informal though they were, showed a spike in positive sentiment toward Jasmine Crockett's leadership style. The split-screen moment, Dan shouting, Jasmine steady, became symbolic more than just a debate highlight. It was replayed not as a clip from a political spar, but as a parable of two Americas colliding. One that thrived on outrage, the other that embodied resilience. And yet, even as the digital world buzzed with noise, something deeper was taking shape. Beyond the hashtags, beyond the memes, beyond the late-night jokes, this moment was crystallizing into cultural memory, because in that single exchange, people saw not just a politician versus a pundit, they saw a reflection of themselves. The immigrant student silenced in class. The young worker talked over in meetings. The parent dismissed when speaking with authority. Jasmine's calm defiance became their stand-in, her victory their vindication, and as social media kept looping the moment, one refrain echoed across comment sections and captions alike. She didn't just win the debate. She won the room. She won the night. She won the narrative. But what no one knew yet was that the impact wouldn't end online. The cultural ripple was only beginning, and its reach would stretch far beyond the feeds and screens, because this wasn't just a viral clash. It was the beginning of a larger shift, and its true weight was about to reveal itself. When the dust settled and the feeds began to quiet, one truth remained undeniable. Dignity had triumphed over dismissal. What Jasmine Crockett displayed on that stage was not just political skill, it was the timeless reminder that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers with unshakable calm, and in that calm lies the power to topple arrogance. For millions watching, her steady response was more than a political moment. It was a blueprint. She had faced a man trying to belittle her, drown her out, and strip her of authority. Instead of matching his rage, she redefined the terms of battle. By refusing to stoop to his level, she exposed how shallow his performance really was. And in that instant, she proved a lesson as old as struggle itself. When underestimated, rise higher. Think about the resonance of that message. Across the country, countless people know what it feels like to be shouted down, ignored, or dismissed, at work, at school, in daily life. They know the sting of being called unfit, the frustration of being silenced by someone louder, but not wiser. Jasmine's example offered a counterspell. It said, "You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to match disrespect with disrespect. True power is found in restraint, in clarity, in refusing to give away your composure." And this is what makes her response so lasting. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about embodying respect in the face of arrogance. She reminded everyone watching that respect endures while arrogance fades. The clip that went viral wasn't just entertaining, it was instructive. It showed that real leadership is not about decibels, but about dignity. That's why Jasmine has come to symbolize more than just one politician holding her own. In that exchange, she became a mirror for every underdog who has ever been told to sit down, for every woman who has been interrupted, for every immigrant who has been spoken over, for every worker who has been dismissed. Her calm response transformed into a rallying cry. Your worth is not measured by how loud you are, but by how steady you remain when tested. And make no mistake, arrogance will always test dignity. There will always be those who think volume can replace vision, who believe bluster can hide weakness. But arrogance is fleeting. It burns fast and collapses under its own weight. Dignity, on the other hand, is enduring. It builds, it lasts, it inspires. That's why people didn't remember Bongino's words. They remembered Jasmine's. The moral of this clash stretches beyond politics. It's about every human encounter where one side wields noise and intimidation and the other stands rooted in truth. The takeaway is universal. Composure is not weakness. It's unshakable strength. Respect is not soft. It is revolutionary. For the immigrant child growing up in a world that tells them to blend in and stay quiet, Jasmine's moment says, stand tall, even when the room gets loud. For the activist fighting to be heard in a system stacked against them, it says, your calm persistence is more powerful than their tantrums. For every ordinary person facing arrogance at any level, it says, dignity is your shield, and truth is your sword. And so, as the echoes of that debate continue to ripple, one truth becomes clear. Jasmine Crockett didn't just dismantle Dan Bongino that night. She gifted America a moral compass. She reminded us that the measure of a leader, of a human being, is not found in shouting matches, but in the quiet resilience to rise above them. Her words will not be remembered because they were loud, but because they were lasting. And as history has shown time and again, it is the steady voices that carry furthest. Because when you are underestimated, there is only one answer: rise higher. And so we return to the moment that started it all, Dan Bongino shouting, the room shaking with tension, and Jasmine Crockett answering with words so calm they froze the air. That exchange wasn't just a viral clash. It was a revelation. Bongino brought volume. Jasmine brought vision. And in the end, it was dignity that won the day. Her response will be replayed not because it was loud, but because it was lasting. It flipped the script on arrogance, proving that strength isn't measured in how hard you shout. It's measured in how steady you remain when others try to silence you. That's why people are still talking about it. That's why it spread across timelines, group chats, and living rooms. It wasn't just a debate. It was a mirror for our times. But here's the bigger truth. This story isn't just about Jasmine. It's about us. About every person who has ever been told to sit down, who has ever been interrupted, dismissed, or underestimated. Her moment showed what happens when we refuse to be shaken. It showed that when you stand in your truth, you can shift the entire room, and that's the invitation for all of us, to carry that same calm strength into our own lives, to choose dignity over arrogance, to rise higher when others try to drag us down. If this moment moved you, if it reminded you of the power of composure and truth, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe now. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder. Leave a comment and add your voice to the movement, because this isn't just about watching, it's about standing together. Dignity won tonight. Let's make sure it wins tomorrow too.